Thank you very much. A lot of what I do is fundraising, and I notice there are probably not too many people from the university here because they run when I come in their direction. I've been coming to China for a long time, and when I go to mainland China, I go Wa-ai Zhenghua, which is very true. It's my honor to introduce our panel. First of all, we're going to talk about the current relations between the U.S. and China and what the future may hold. And our first speaker will be Dr. Kenneth Lieberthal, who was a distinguished professor from the University of Michigan, worked at the Brookings Institute, and ran the East Asian desk in the Clinton administration. The next speaker will be Dr. Mary Gallagher, who's the chair of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan. Her specialty is political science and labor. And then finally, it will be Dr. Michael Barr, who is the dean of the Gerald R School of Public Policy. We stole him away when he was working for both the Clinton and the Obama administration and worked in our Treasury Department. So first of all, I'd like to have Ken come up.
Thank you, Richard. It's always a great pleasure to come back to Hong Kong and to have an opportunity to be at the Asia Society here. I'm sorry Ronnie Chang is out of town today, but I've had many good experiences here, and I'm delighted to re-engage in this venue. Each of us is going to speak for only about 10 minutes, and because we really want to hear your questions and your comments. So we're going to tee up various dimensions of the U.S.-China relationship. Let me begin with an overview that tries to capture, I think, the dynamics on both sides. Let me say, I've followed this relationship closely since a little before Richard Nixon made his visit to China in 1972. So I've been at it for a long time. I mention that not to highlight my advanced age, but rather to make an important point. I have never seen, certainly since the late 70s, and I think even since just before the Nixon visit, I have never seen our relationship headed downhill in so many different dimensions at the same time. You know, we've had, Lord knows, we've had economic tensions and conflicts. We've had issues on the military side. We've had cyber issues, all kinds of things. Almost everywhere you look, the relationship is headed downhill. It's headed downhill in a significant fashion. Let me just highlight that, just tick off some of the major areas. Economics and trade, dominating the headlines, so you're all on top of that. In fact, in a sense, it's getting all the attention. And a major point that I want to highlight is that if we resolve the economic and trade issues tomorrow, the relationship would still be in deep trouble because of what's happening in other spheres that aren't getting so much attention, but are in fact extremely important. On both sides, military doctrines, policies, and deployments have shifted and increasingly are concerned with offsetting, protecting yourself from the other side. But we're in a kind of security dilemma where what one side does defensively, the other side interprets as offensive intent and does its response, and it produces its own dynamic, which is hard to break out of. Intelligence assessments and related arrests and sanctions have been part of what's been going on for some time now. Taiwan policy. I think the formal policies haven't changed, but the actions have behind those policies, and risks have gone up regarding Taiwan. And frankly, that worries me because I think that is the one area where when China says that's a core interest, and they really cannot back off to something that looks like a real challenge to Taiwan's status. That worries me because I'm not sure how fully that's understood. by everyone involved on the U.S. side. Education and general access to research, cultural exchange, all of those are experiencing substantially new restrictions over the last couple of years on both sides. Cyber activities and the technology acquisition practices of each side. Again, this is in the headlines now, but there has been a lot going on in both of those areas, and it's been very difficult to get your arms around and put some boundaries on. The rhetorical framing of many initiatives that in other terms would have been framed honestly as we're, trying to provide additional aid to help, to help build infrastructure that will help development, is now increasingly being framed as we've got to do this because it's the only thing that will stop the BRI or something. The U.S. has a Build Act, which, it's committed some funds for infrastructure. So that the framing of issues on both sides increasingly points to the other as the reason to be doing this. That's not a good development. Visa issues, again, are becoming more difficult on both sides and are not driven by the foreign ministry in China and by the State Department of the United States. I would argue each of those have virtually no control over that at all. It's by the FBI and Homeland Security in the United States and by the Ministry of State Security in China. And they don't like each other. So the results of that are very troublesome. What adds to the problem, to my mind, is policies change. Policies reflect politics and personality and all that kind of thing. But in both countries, these policies that are producing increasing tensions are over time being changed increasingly into laws and regulations. And in both countries, when it becomes law and regulation, it becomes much harder to change. Interests build up around that very quickly. There are procedures to get them in place. You don't just sweep them aside. And so I think that even if there's a will to move things in a more positive direction, in many of these areas, it's going to be a long time before you can really change the underlying law and regulation that keeps the momentum in the wrong direction. This situation, let me stress, did not start with Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. I think Mary will talk about some of the more fundamental origins of this. Let me say, though, that larger-than-life leaders in both countries now are individuals who came into place determined to have big impacts both domestically and internationally in their own country's domestic policy and in their own country's way of dealing with the world. And they're very different people, but each is a strong leader and quite determined in their own unique ways to, in many ways, disrupt what they inherited. And so that it does certainly contribute to what we are all now facing. One more basic point, because I have recommendations for what we ought to do about this, but I'm going to leave those to, if you have particular questions or want to suggest things, let's leave it for the Q&A part. But as I look ahead, we face very significant risks that are greater than they were in the past. One, let me just tick these off with a word about each. One, crisis management. In the United States, we basically don't have a crisis management process that is coordinated, that you could count on to provide accurate information at the top, to coordinate evaluation of risks and opportunity, coordinate implementation, and coordinate the messages that will be sent out as part of managing a crisis. That has really broken down very badly within the administration. In China, I would argue that the capacity to manage crises in a measured, coordinated fashion has deteriorated in the last few years. It's deteriorated in part because the incentives to highlight a nuanced set of options, communicate accurately what has occurred, and therefore, what the top leader will be dealing with, and coordination of implementation across different issue areas, that has also deteriorated. And the incentives, it would take a very brave person to stand up to President Xi and said, I'm sorry, what you had us do yesterday really turned out to be a disaster. So, and this is what's going on the ground, and you really got to change tack. That would take a great deal of courage, and the incentives are not in that direction. So the quality of information the top leaders would access, the debate about and prioritization of policy options, all those kinds of things are not as functioning as well as they did in the past. And we have not faced a crisis with China. We've faced tensions, but not a crisis. There are areas where crisis could occur very rapidly in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, across the Taiwan Strait. I mean, there are just a lot of things that have the potential. Secondly, the trade war escalates, and ironically, there's some danger if it is, well, let me just leave it at that, the dynamics of the trade war. Thirdly, and I'll wrap this up in literally 1 minute. Thirdly, in the cyber arena, all the focus publicly is being on security issues, cyber security. But in fact, one of the major issues is that advances are taking place in kind of different silos in the cyber world, in artificial intelligence and deep learning, in 5G, and so the speed of the network and the amounts of information it can handle, in virtual reality and augmented reality, in quantum computing. All this is with a reality that more and more of everything that's done in the world is done in on a digital platform and is translated in digital, captured in the digital realm. And the changes are occurring rapidly enough that no government can create laws and regulations and implement them fast enough to deal with problems before the problem has disappeared and morphed into some other problem. And so we have in addition to the issues we all know about, there's an underlying issue of simply the speed of change. And I think that will continue to contribute to growing U.S.-Chinese mistrust, because no one really knows what's going on fully, and no government really knows fully what's happening in the dynamics of the systems that they have. And that's a very worrisome development. And then finally, the Asian, not only economic framework, but security frameworks are now shifting, but it's not clear exactly what they're shifting to. And so again, something where there was a lot of stability in what you could anticipate for the coming year is now not as stable and not clear exactly how it will shake out. When you put all that together, you've got momentum going in a negative direction, policy process not what it was in the past and what it needs to be, and a set of objective developments out in the region that pose risks as we go forward. There are things we could do, and there are things China could do, and there are things that all of you could do that might contribute to putting more of a buffer around this. But I'm going to turn it over to Mary Gallagher to pick up from here. Start with a smile, because I think I've really depressed you.
Thank you for the invitation from the Asia Society. I'm going to talk today about some of the domestic issues. I'm going to time myself so I don't go over time. And I'm going to start off just briefly talking about China and then move to the U.S. And hopefully each question helps us move along a little bit. So the first thing I just want to talk about is the Chinese domestic context and why the government is so worried about the economy and the transition that the Chinese economy has been going through since at least 2012, the new normal that Xi Jinping has talked about, the slowing growth, and this idea of the middle income trap, that China needs to move beyond its old model of development and move to reform its domestic institutions so that economic development can be based on productivity, gains, and technological innovation. So the government, I think, for a while has felt like it's in this very difficult process. Two of social issues that they've paid attention to, the central government in particular, even far earlier than 2012, is one is reducing inequality. Since about 2006, the central government has talked about getting rid of the hukou system, of the household registration system, so that inequality in China is not based on institutional divisions that are fundamentally unfair, and that also not just impact people's income, but also people's access to education and healthcare, and the urban-rural divide, which I know has changed a lot recently, but is still a big problem. Related to that is the need to improve social security. So if we think about Chinese, how people feel secure in China, there are two kind of basic ways. If you're in rural China, you have land security. If you're in urban China, you hope you have employment security and you get pensions, through employment. Both of these types of security are under threat in China. And so China really needs to find new ways to provide social security. In rural China, because of really rapid urbanization, people are losing their access to land. In some cases, they're getting urban hukou, but urban hukou is not very reliable for security if it doesn't provide a full-time job in the formal sector. And so what's happening in both cases, rapid urbanization for rural people, and then the rise of the gig economy, automation in urban China, and just changes in the economy, both of these types of security are really under threat. So as the population ages, this desire for social security has grown, and without a deeper sense of security, rapid urbanization will be very difficult for China to accomplish, which is the new engine of growth for the Chinese economy, or at least that's hoped. So what's interesting about these problems in the Chinese case is that it's really not that different from some of the problems that we see in the United States. The United States has severe problems of inequality, access to healthcare, access to quality education, and it has largely ignored rebuilding the social safety net that would mitigate the effects of globalization, particularly on regions and sectors that have been hard hit by outsourcing and competition with countries like China. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been giving talks in China about research I'm doing on the impact of what's been called the China shock on workers in the upper Midwest. And these are areas where there's very concentrated effects of globalization in terms of unemployment and industrial decline. And American workers, what I want to just lay out briefly, and we can talk about it more in Q&A, is that American workers seem to exhibit a really distinctive kind of populism. Populism is something we see happening around the globe. It was evident in the European Parliament elections this morning. American workers, at least in these sectors and in these regions, exhibit a kind of populism I'm calling market populism, because it is fundamentally about closing the market down as opposed to boosting the role of the state in sort of mitigating the bad effects of a market economy. So they emphasize things like economic nationalism, this idea that the United States is in a zero-sum competition with countries like China. But at the same time, they remain very worried about domestic regulation within the country, which I think is something that sets the United States apart from Europe, where there's a stronger desire for the state to intervene. They reject regulation at home, but at the same time, they have no problem with the idea that Trump should dictate where companies and multinational corporations can invest. So, and again, it's this notion of like, well, we want the market, but we want the market to be closed to us, to our participation. They have very localized concerns. Those concerns are not necessarily captured by their own self-interest or their income level. Those are concerns that are often about the broader community that has been really hard hit by globalization. And the China shock literature, which is mainly done by economists, looks at things like the relationship between China shock and opioid abuse, rises and increases in unemployment and divorce. And so these are community concerns that overlap with income and with class and with education, but are more fundamentally about a community. And finally, they feel very helpless in their roles, which they see as a role as a worker. They realize as workers in the United States, they are not competitive in the global market that they compete in. And they know that they have wages that are too high. They know they have lifestyles that don't really work with massive amounts of overtime and competing with workers in developing countries. As consumers, they feel hypocritical because they tell other Americans to buy American when they themselves know they shop at Walmart and buy Chinese goods. And as voters, I would describe them almost as nihilists. So they believe that the system doesn't work. I will support politicians who want to break the system. And so this is a kind of market populism, or a kind of populism, I think, that is really distinctively American. I think this kind of rise of this type of populism in the United States is one of the reasons why the economy no longer unites the U.S. China relationship. So traditionally, of course, there was this notion that economic engagement with China is what sort of bound the countries together, even though their political systems were different. Now at this mass level, you have the impact of the China shock, you have this backlash against globalization, and at the elite level, particularly in DC, you have a belief that competition with China is on all dimensions, and that economic competition is part of national security. So there's a unification of sort of mass concerns with elite concerns, even though those concerns are kind of fundamentally different. So this is a complete turnaround from the policy of engagement, which underwrote most of our policy in China since Nixon. This also, I think, leads to an understanding, which Ken said as well, which is that this conflict will outlast the Trump administration, whether it ends next year or ends 5 years from now. It's likely to be dealt with differently by a different leader and by a different party, but there's bipartisan support in the United States for the trade conflict, which I think is probably the only area where there is agreement between the Democratic leadership and the Trump administration. So this is not something that is wholly manufactured from the administration. You see anti-China rhetoric and policy that unifies the Trump administration with some of the progressive candidates in the Democratic Party now, like Bernie Sanders. And I think, again, the only issue I think that I've heard Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi talk about positively in regards to Trump has been the trade conflict. So I'm going to end with the last question, which is why the two most common historical lessons that we use in the United States, that are commonly used in the United States, are wrong. So the conflict between the two countries is being portrayed by some as a clash of civilizations. Sometimes this is a clash of ideology, and sometimes it's a clash of culture or race. Most recently typified by an argument about China being the first non-Caucasian power that we are fighting, which is not true, but whatever. So the ideological solution is the lesson, or the historical example is the USSR. So just get rid of communism in China and the problem will be solved. And the cultural solution, or the racial solution, is the Japan example, which is get Japan to change its practices, which were often portrayed in the 1980s as a cultural issue, and the problem will be solved. So these historical metaphors are really misplaced for two reasons. First, they minimize the conflict by putting it into this box with a solution, which is to change China. And they seem to have a kind of misconception that if these things are solved, China will go away or be changed so fundamentally that its behavior will also fundamentally change. Second, I think the problem also exacerbates the problem by focusing so much on changing China, which just antagonizes people in China who do not want to be told what to do by the United States. So it ignores the basic problem, which is not a clash of civilizations, but rather is how does the U.S. unipolar system adjust to China in any form, whether China is communist, whether China is culturally distinctive. And saying that the answer is to change China doesn't, in the end, fundamentally solve the problem. A democratic China could be equally, if not more, nationalistic. A market-based, competitive China, which might come about because of the trade conflict, could be equally, if not more, difficult for the United States to compete with. So I will stop with those two historical metaphors and welcome your questions. Thank you.
My name is Michael Barr. I'm the Dean of the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. I'm honored to be here with this distinguished panel, and I want to thank the Asia Society, and in particular Alice Meng and her staff, who, as you heard, put this event together in short order. So I'm very glad to be here. My remarks are going to be really consistent with what you heard from Mary and Ken, maybe with a slightly different twist to them. Maybe we'll start with the short-term set of issues around trade. And I really want to emphasize that the trade issues are, in many respects, quite simple. The U.S. and Canada, the U.S. and China have been, Canada is the other country we're having a big fight with now because we don't have enough fights to have in the world, and Australia and Mexico and the EU. But the U.S. China conversation about trade has been going on for a very long time. Even under the Trump administration, they've now had 11 rounds of trade discussions at quite detailed level. But for years preceding that, the United States and China have been engaged in an economic dialogue where there's been, over time, agreement on a set of principles for how to resolve the key issues in the trade dispute on intellectual property, on the sort of forced technology transfer issues, on market structure issues. And in some key ways, the Chinese government has been, in fits and starts, not consistently, but positively moving towards implementation of a number of those issues. So I think the key thing about the current trade discussions is that if both sides wanted to reach agreement on the trade issues, we have a very clear set of principles and even a high level of details about how to work that out. And I think what's happened, there's lots of debate about the details of exactly why the trade agreement broke down that we can talk about in the Q&A. But I think the bigger point is that when the discussions broke down for whatever reason, there was miscommunication between both sides. And the Trump administration in the United States chose to react to what it perceived as changes in China's negotiating position in a way that was extremely negative, and that has been pulling both China and the United States apart in the trade area when they should have been very close to being pulled together. And I think that's really unnecessary. And then, of course, China responded in a similar fashion to President Trump's reassertion of the need to impose higher and more tariffs. And we're, as I'll say more in just a bit, engaged now in this tit-for-tat process that is not in either country's interests. It's in China's interest to agree to the provisions in the trade negotiation. It will help China grow faster, as Mary indicated. It's in the United States' interest to agree to the provisions in the trade agreement. And it's in neither country's interest to engage in the tit-for-tat tariff war. Both China and the United States are already being hurt by that. And I should say, not just the United States and China, it's already having a serious effect on other countries in the region because our global economies are so integrated and so much of the production function relates to those two big powers. The trade discussion is taking place, as you've heard from Ken and Mary, in the context of a much more complicated set of issues that are much harder to resolve, that are much longer term, and that are much more uncertain. And some of those relate to the economic issues that Mary described. We're all from the University of Michigan. Michigan is one of the several states that has been hit hardest by changes in production over the last 50 years. Some of that is driven by technology, some of that is driven by globalization, some of that is driven by inefficiencies in the U.S. labor market, some of that is driven by the rise of China in the global trading system. And that concentrated economic shock in the United States in manufacturing, in apparels and furniture, for example, means that there are parts of the country that are extremely susceptible to argumentation that is of this zero-sum nature. All of our problems are because of China. All of our problems are because of immigration. All of our problems are because of people who don't look like us. And so there is a receptivity to xenophobic and racist attitudes that connects with, is not the same as, but connects with these economic dislocations. I think a second underlying factor that's quite complicated, and again was alluded to before, is the nature of the United States as a global power and China as a rising power in the international economic and strategic system. And we've seen this many times over many centuries. When there are dominant powers and rising powers, there's the potential for conflict. And that means there's a responsibility on the side of both the dominant power and the rising power to acknowledge and deal with that potential conflict. So the United States has duties towards China in terms of helping it enter the international system in a way that acknowledges its rising role. And China has responsibilities as a rising power to recognize that it's disrupting the dominant power and take steps to avoid kinds of conflicts that may spiral out of control. And I think in both instances, both in the case of the United States and the case of China, both countries have taken steps that are inconsistent with their duties, if you will, to the international system. In the case of the United States, for example, the United States did not take the kinds of steps that it should have to bring China into having a commensurate role in the IMF or in the World Bank, commensurate with its growing authority in the international economic system. And you saw the response from China is to be much more aggressive in terms of building out its own Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank and the Belt and Roads Initiative. And so these activities come in parallel to each other. Both sides generate some responsibility for trying to find a way to mediate what is going to happen, which is that China will grow stronger over time, and therefore the U.S. will be relatively less important over time than it had been in the past. A third major backdrop to this that I'm quite worried about is what I perceive to be a demise of U.S. leadership more broadly in the international system. And that plays through into the China discussion. So the current United States administration has exhibited a lot of hostility to the international global order that the United States built and led since World War II. You see that in its shunning of the World Trade Organization. You see it in its shunning of the NATO alliance, in the critique of the European Union that the United States had backed and fostered for every decade since World War II. This abandonment of the approach that relies on alliances and multilateralism to help build a stronger world. And that has real risks for the U.S. relationship with China if the United States is going it alone as it is. You also see, I think, problems with Chinese leadership. And I'm, unlike Ken and Mary, not an expert in China. But as an outside observer from my experience in academia and government, looking at financial regulation and global financial policy, China has taken steps in recent years that are not consistent with the idea of opening to the financial sector that it had long promised to do. There is a very significant tightening of the business climate in China. And that has meant, for that and other reasons, that the U.S. business community has diminished its support for engagement with China. It used to be in the U.S. political scene that one of the factors in having a little bit of a difference in Republican and Democratic views in the legislature, at least, was that the U.S. business community was strongly pro-engagement in China, and that has flipped in recent years. The U.S. business community is very much on board with a tough on China kind of stance that you're seeing from the current administration, and I think that is a dramatic change. So let me just pause with and move to our discussion in just a minute with final observation. You can, I think about the U.S. China relationship as having, at least in a big picture sense, three kinds of potential futures, three paths forward from here. One path forward is the one that we're currently on, which I think is rather grim, where both the U.S. and China decide that they're actually fine with having an escalating conflict. And they welcome the kind of tit-for-tat responses that we've been seeing very recently. And that could result in a kind of death spiral of tit-for-tat actions that lead to significant economic, strategic, intellectual, and other conflict. As I said, that's the path I think we're currently on. I hope that we get off of it. A second path that I wish we could be on, but I don't think is politically plausible for either country, is to return to the situation we were in even just 4 or 5 years ago, where both the U.S. and China had disputes about particularized issues, but there was a shared goal of moving forward. I don't think that position is politically plausible anymore for either country domestically, even though I wish it were. And then the third path, which is one I hope we get to, and we still have a chance to get to, is muddling through with a greater sense of generosity and a slow rebuilding of trust and a slow movement back towards a system of cooperation, a slow repairing of the breach in the relationship that would let us avoid the worst outcomes while both countries began to adjust to the new reality of their relationship. And so I'm not hopeful that we'll get to the second path, but I am at least open to the idea that we'll get to the third path, and that's a lot better one than the one we're currently on.
Thank you for those comments. I'd like to ask the first question. When I first came to China, it was with Ken and a group from Michigan, including former Ambassador Leonard Woodcock. And Ambassador Woodcock gave several examples of what he said was that the American and Chinese people love each other, but sometimes the governments don't get along. Can we get, does that still exist, and can we keep that going? I'll open it up to the panel.
Is this working? Yes, okay. I'll let my distinguished colleagues talk about China. I'll just say from the United States perspective, I'm not sure. There's always been an element of hostility in some sectors of the U.S. public to the opening to China, even back to Nixon. And one of the things that has kept that in check is that the leadership in the United States was united in the belief that that engagement with China was positive. And so I worry that we now have leadership in the United States that is xenophobic and racist, and that is reinforcing an element of our society that is that shares that view.
So, okay, on the Chinese side, I think because the political systems are different, that being in China the last few weeks, I had a little bit of like cognitive dissonance. I felt that we're obviously not reading the same information. We have different ideas about basic facts of the story involving the trade war and involving what happened with Huawei. And this, I'm in most cases talking to people who probably have access to external sources, but are choosing to believe a story that is more domestically generated and is more nationalistic. So I do think that there are trends on both sides that can, as I've described for these people I've been talking to in the United States, where economic nationalism is much stronger, and in China, it's partly, particularly at the mass level, it has a lot to do with the information that people are accessing, which is actually a problem not just in China, it's a problem in many, many countries. In the U.S., it's generated differently because people choose to access news that reiterates what they already believe, and in the Chinese case, it's more that because the government has more control, they have limited access to different stories. But I think the information about the information that makes people believe things is problematic in both countries, but for different reasons.
Everything that should be said has been said, but not everyone has had a chance to say it, so I'll add mine. I think that I've always been impressed when I've gone to China over the years, starting actually in the mid-'70s, so a lot of years, at how much when Americans and Chinese get together face to face, the experiences are good. You know, it just, what you appreciate is you say China, there's no such thing. I mean, China is a continent, it is a civilization, it is enormously diverse, enormously dynamic. You know, different places are very different within China. So when you say China does this and China thinks that, you're reifying it to a point where it's a caricature. And the same in the opposite direction. Anyone who travels around America sees the same thing. You know? What worries me especially about the current situation is that we are now starting to diminish the opportunities and the desire of people in each country to spend serious time in the other. And so the caricature becomes increasingly the kind of perception of what's really true out there, not textured by real experience with real people, which usually makes you think better of what's going on in the other place. One other thing, I think each of us, the leaders, populations, yes, too, but especially the leaders, the political leaders in each country, really do not understand the politics in the other country. China tries to expends considerable effort to make sure you don't understand the politics there, right? No, I'm serious. You know, it's just, you know, it's not a system that is self-revelatory, right? In America, the problem is it's too damn complicated. And there are too many folks that are saying this and saying that you don't know what to believe, right? Mm-hmm. And it's always been the case. I mean, we're just that's the way we are. So on both sides, assumptions about what must be underlying their motivations and their goals tend to be used to connect the dots, because most of the other stuff that would connect the dots you really are not confident in. And for a long time, I've always been surprised at the extent to which Chinese counterparts have worked on the underlying assumption, which recent developments lend some credibility to, but I, frankly, before that, never thought it had much reality to it, that America, regardless of how much we would try to encourage China to get involved more in the international institutions, regardless of what we would do to try to provide expertise to China through the World Bank in some cases, through, you know, directly bilaterally in other cases and so forth. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, America was engaged in a wide-ranging conspiracy to hold China back. Right? That just at the end of the day, America would never let China advance and fulfill its legitimate goals. And nothing could shake that, because with a conspiracy theory, unfortunately, no matter what happens, you can find a way to fit it into the conspiracy. I can remember times when I would say, but we are doing X, which we wouldn't do. I mean, it's clearly what you've been asking for, and what you've indicated as a priority. We're doing everything we can to make it happen. Yeah, it just shows how tricky you are, right? Because it's covering up what the real goals are. And in America, there are folks who think the same way about China. That ultimately the goal is to replace us, not to realize their goals, and where the world is a better place because both countries are functioning well and both peoples are doing well, and the rest of the world is sharing in the good results that come from that. So, it's in part different systems where we don't know enough about the other to really be confident that we know what's going on there politically. And then at a popular level, when people get together, they tend to be very impressed.
I'm sure we have some questions.
But we're
from the
reducing that.
Audience. Nate, do we have a microphone? We have right here first.
Okay, thanks. Can you just tell me what you think about sanctions as a way of making the world work the way that you want it to? Sanctions.
I might comment a little bit, and then Ken has had a lot of experience in this too. I think that sometimes sanctions can work and be helpful in bringing parties to the table. It's very difficult, and when ultimately successful, they've been successful in cases where the sanctions are imposed on a multilateral basis, not on a sole country's decision, and where the parties imposing the sanctions provide the sanctioned entity or countries with a clear path that is substantively open to them and politically open to them to resolve the sanctions process. So the combination of multilateralism and a clear exit, I think in the cases in which sanctions have worked, have been quite critical.
Over here.
Oh, hey, Brian. Okay. Could you tell me what you think is the greatest force shaping the 21st century?
Climate change.
I'm totally.
Good answer.
Okay, listen. I'm totally shocked that y'all seem to be in the 20th century. Okay, 20th century, the big concern was overpopulation. The 21st century, the biggest force shaping it is demographics. People are not having enough children in the developed world. All right, and this is why China is incapable of continuing to grow. It's an aging society. The mean age in China is 38, as it is in the U.S. And the reactionary you see in the U.S. is because we're getting old. Old people are xenophobic and racist and narrow-minded, okay? But in China, well, maybe not you, or well, not yet, okay? But this is true. Old people tend to be conservative. Young people tend to be liberal. And we see like the failure of the EU, of Brexit. A lot of things shaping this are the fact that populations are aging. And old people don't like to see the world change. And the most important thing is, if you don't have children, the country no longer exists. So we're faced with countries going the way of the Etruscans and the Assyrians and the Babylonians because they're not having enough children. And this is most evident in China. If you travel throughout China, the U.S., still have immigration. So even though our mean age is the same as China, we're not yet facing the severe problems of a disappearing workforce and an aging population. And you travel throughout China, you'll see, as I have, huge cities that are entirely empty because in order to maintain social stability, they have to provide employment. And in the short term, this means construction. So they've overbuilt, and these places are not going to be filled with people because China is aging and dying. And the new generation has more men than women, and young people simply are not getting married. They prefer to have little lap dogs than babies, all right? I've been to China, and I've seen it, and this is a very rapid development. And so to some extent, if we can all sit tight and not go to war, Japan, China, Korea will not be around anymore. So stability in Asia in the long term is not really a factor, as it was in the 20th century. But in the short term, the danger is in Sparta, the Spartans kept the boys and girls apart too much, and Sparta faced demographic suicide. But before they died out, they managed to destroy Athens. So,
Thank you.
okay,
We have some other questions. Can we,
okay.
instead of a lecture?
I mean, I did actually mention demographics and I mentioned aging. We didn't ignore it, but I think the other thing that China, South Korea, and Japan, I agree they're aging very rapidly, and people do not want to have children, and immigration is also politically problematic in those countries, mostly more so in Japan than, but in all three. But the key problem or the key uncertainty about this issue of demographics is that work is going to change far, far faster than the populations. I mean, those countries are not going to die out before the rise of sort of robotics and AI totally fundamentally change how we work. So I'm just saying it's uncertain, we don't know. And so I don't think it's correct to say that these populations are going to be extinct before there's kind of a revolution. And how many people we actually need and how many children I should have as a woman with a job. Just
Can
saying.
we have the gentleman in blue and then the gentleman in the back, please?
Thank you. Professor Barr, you mentioned that you think it's important that we have a system of cooperation with China like we had 4 or 5 years ago. When I think of cooperating, my question is if it makes sense to cooperate with a system that has imprisoned 1 million people in Xinjiang. There are a lot of dissidents in China, human rights activists that say the trade war is a chance to end the rule of the CCP. So do you think that's maybe also a goal to strive for?
I don't think that the trade war is going to help human rights activists in China. I agree that human rights ought to be an important part of the U.S.-Chinese relationship, and that the United States should press for reforms in China, as are Chinese reformers. In the current administration, there is no attention at all to human rights. So winning the trade war in some sense isn't gonna help. I think having a healthier relationship where you are engaging on a wider range of issues is more likely to be successful at that than the path that we're on now.
Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I'd argue that the case against China is actually not true, given the fact that the U.S. economy is doing so well, low inflation, full employment, and the stock market is doing very well. So I think the thing that was being put forward, that Republican and Democrats are united, that China has been taking advantage of U.S. and in trade matters and all that, isn't true. And so I just wondering, and there are existing mechanisms like WTO or whatever to take care of any kind of differences if people pursue things in a rational manner. But I actually also wanted to ask you, do you think that Trump would would do better with or without a trade deal with China, and that also whether Trump will get reelected?
Let me. I'll take a first stab at 2 of those 3 questions. I think overall, the growth of China has been incredibly positive to the United States, as it has to Chinese citizens. And overall, the U.S. economy is thriving. So I don't think you heard any of us say that China is doing some harm to the United States overall. I think the point we were trying to make, or a couple of us were trying to make, is that if you look at the effects overall of globalization and the effects overall of automation, they have had concentrated negative effects in some communities in the United States that give rise to concerns that get reflected in the rise of Trump and in the trade war we're in now. So that's the basic nature of the argument. But I think from a social welfare perspective overall, it's been enormously positive for the U.S., for China, for the world, for for China to really have been integrated into the global market system. In the United States, we failed to take the steps necessary to help people who were negatively impacted by rapid changes in our economy. Again, not just China, but globalization, technology, changes in the nature of work. And instead of investing in retraining workers, in educating workers, in providing income supports directly to workers who were affected, we sort of waved our hands at it. We had some very small trade adjustment programs, but we did not do anything at a scale commensurate with the rapid changes in the U.S. economy, and that I think the U.S. government is to blame for. So that's to your first point. Your second point about does a U.S.-China trade deal help or hurt Trump? I'm just going to guess that the tit-for-tat tariff process we're currently in helps him a lot with his supporters, who at least for now have not connected the economic dots to the political dots. So I think that the question for President Trump is going to be, political question for President Trump is going to be, when do those two lines merge? And I think that he's at some grave political risk if he lets this go on for a long time, because it will become increasingly obvious to people who are negatively affected by the tit-for-tat tariffs that he's hurt their economic interests. And so I think it's a little bit of a question of when these two currently separate lines merge in economics and politics.
I agree with whatever Michael just said about the first question. On the second question, one thing I think that is potentially dangerous for both countries is that there are reasons for both President Trump and President Xi to prefer a kind of prolonged conflict over trade. So for Trump, I think it appeals to his most fundamental supporters, who are something like 30 to 35% of the population, because it appears as if he is doing something, and they like, in a kind of visceral way, when he behaves like that. And so it appeals to them, and I think even if there are short-term costs with the economy being fairly good, they may not absorb those costs, or may not think about those costs as coming directly from what he is doing as president. For President Xi Jinping, the Chinese economy was slowing down for other reasons. The trade conflict is probably likely to make it even slower. And as the economy slows down, Xi Jinping now has a very good, not necessarily, it's not completely a scapegoat, because it did have some impact, but it's a way in which the United States can be blamed for something that was already going to happen. And I'm not answering the question about if he's going to win or not.
I've got two questions.
Kenna's going to answer that question. You going to answer that question?
Young lady?
No.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question based on previous comment by Professor Lieberthal. Do you think it's possible for the two governments to understand each other? If it's impossible, is there any way out to solve the crisis? Thank you.
I think that the governments have demonstrated for most of the past 40 years that we can identify areas where, if we work in parallel fashion or actively cooperate, we each get closer to the goals that we seek. And so, yes, it isn't that we understood each other all that well, and where it especially comes into play is when a leader says, I'm willing to make best efforts, but at the end of the day, I can't get there because of the domestic forces I face. Do you believe him? Right? And that's where you really run into problems. Right now, we have our two leaders essentially saying that there is a geopolitical competition, and that competition is not win-win. And that makes it much more difficult to identify the areas where cooperation will really work to the good of both. I answered not facetiously to this question about the 21st century, that I thought climate change was going to be the biggest issue of the 21st century and the most consequential. 3 years ago, we finally got our governments to agree on that and began to work together. And if we don't work together on that issue, we're all toast. Unfortunately, we now have a leadership in the United States that rejects that conclusion. But I think that is one area where if any Democratic candidate wins in the next presidential election, we will again really take climate change as a very important issue and is one that is inherently transnational. And the U.S. and China are the biggest players on the technology side, on the emissions side, in every way you can imagine. And so I think that's an example of where there is hope for cooperation, even if we don't fully understand the politics on the other side.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, to the answer, because I work very closely with several of the universities in China on medical research and with joint institutes. And I have to tell you that the Chinese government is pushing for further cooperation. Even today, with all the negative that you read in the press and some of the stuff that you read is not what happens. They are actively pushing for more collaboration. Michael?
Just picking up on Rich's point, in my conversations over the last several weeks with universities across the region, including in China, there has been a real thirst and hunger for deepening the collaborations between U.S. universities and Chinese universities. And I think that is going to be even more important as the relationship between the two countries enters this more difficult, more complicated period, both to build a deeper really to build a deeper understanding in the two cultures and societies about what's going on. So I think that's a hopeful note. The other hopeful note I'll say, and this is just building on Ken's point on climate change, even though the U.S. government is no longer pursuing advances in climate change, individual states and localities in the United States are pursuing significant efforts to reduce climate change. And Professor Lin and I were at a conference in Beijing a couple weeks ago where Barry Rabe, who's on the Ford School faculty, and faculty from Renda and other universities in China were talking about subnational strategies to pursue on climate change and whether there might be some possibility of subnational cooperation between Chinese experiments and working on climate change and U.S. and Canadian efforts in that area. So I think there, even in an overall hostile or difficult environment, there are possibilities of deepening collaboration on climate change.
We had a question over here and then over here.
Thanks. A lot of questions, but I have to confess that I've been an advocate for engagement for a lot of years and been involved with it, thinking it benefits both the Chinese and Americans. That isn't very popular now, as you've outlined. But that's been on behalf partly of Hong Kong with the American Chamber of Commerce. So I wanted to bring Hong Kong into this equation a little bit. American Chamber of Commerce is about, again, to send another group to Washington. And they've just gotten some consultants to tell them, well, the good news is that Hong Kong's much more on the radar screen than it was a year ago. The bad news is that Hong Kong's much more on the radar screen than it was a year ago. Can you talk about that, about Hong Kong's role in this whole process and how you think it might be being affected by the U.S. China conflicts of various kinds? Because we are right in the middle of it, and we're very dependent on what goes on, obviously, in the middle of all this. And is there anything we can do?
I say Mary went like this, and Michael and I looked at each other, and each one went, do you want to?
I shook my head more than you.
Thanks. I think that in the administration, Hong Kong is increasingly being seen as a bellwether of whether the one country, two systems model will be eroded to the point where Hong Kong becomes a kind of example of why you can't trust those guys. And in that context, I think that the debate now over the extradition issue has been seized on already in Washington, and is unlikely to be helpful to those who want to build trust between the U.S. and China. And Hong Kong, obviously, economically, is just you're in the middle of everything that happens between the U.S. and China. Most of that is not going in a good direction for Hong Kong's interests at this point. I've always had enormous confidence in Hong Kong. It's a great place, and it's thrived in the midst of an environment, over decades that would not have led you to anticipate thriving as a consequence. But I think that the politics around Hong Kong now are becoming more difficult. And I'm frankly concerned about the erosion of some of the safeguards that we all thought would be more robust for a longer period of time.
Thanks very much. Professor Lieberthal sort of listed a long list, a list of the many sort of issues that are heading in the wrong trajectory, and I agree with you that the trade sort of impasse is perhaps one of the easier ones or possible ones that you could see being resolved, certainly as it relates to the tariffs. One of those that is going the wrong way, but I'd just be interested in your views on, and can it be resolved, and particularly given your conspiracy theory comments, is in the technology sphere. And given how sort of integral technology is to the military complex these days, is there a room for the Made in 2025 initiative of China and becoming a dominant player in AI and a range of these technology things? Can the US really sort of accommodate China and that strategy? And is there any light at the end of this Huawei sort of problem?
I think the big objection to the 2025 program has been, the Made in China program, has been that China is using state resources to drive progress in critical technologies and is generally excluding an open policy to foreign participation in that effort. And given that those technologies have both economic and security dimensions, implications to them, that's produced a lot of pushback. And it's produced among American corporations, major corporations that, as was mentioned earlier, have been really bedrock supporters of at least a healthy U.S.-China relationship. I remember back as far as 2015, you began to hear at at AmCham and other places in the United States that major players a new word came up, reciprocity, right? And we need reciprocity, which is to say we can no longer sit back and watch China pick winners in now the key technologies of the future, exclude the U.S., where we're highly competitive in many of those areas, use state subsidies to enable their firms not only to develop technologies, but then to go abroad and buy our firms and take that technology back to China, and sit back and not press much harder than we have been to change that situation. So I think China is now talking about Made in China less, although I think that may come back, but it's still pursuing it fully. And if China decides that may not be in its best interest over time, which is to say not give up investing in these areas, but make it more open, right? Then I think there's at least potential to again pursue a kind of globalization, greater interdependence, but with standards that are agreed upon and according to broad rules that we all agree upon. Won't solve all issues, but it at least makes it a better situation than now.
Over there and then up front.
I just have a short comment about related. I think one of the things that will play out because of this conflict are changes in supply chains. And partly it's about the inability to separate sort of civilian and military use for a lot of new technologies. But I think the other thing is the behavior of both governments have done this, the U.S. recently with Huawei, but the Chinese government for a while has been using its economic scale to demonstrate to countries that they are dependent on China, right? Partly because supply chains are so dependent, or because the Chinese market is important to them. So you've seen it in South Korea with THAAD, you've seen it in Norway because of human rights. And I think in Japan with rare earths, and I think what is happening is that countries are adjusting to that by diversifying their supply chains and trying to reduce their dependency on China because it is a point by which they will be squeezed. So I think that supply chains will change, and Huawei will probably accelerate it.
Thank you very much for your insights. I'm Alejandro Reyes from the University of Hong Kong. Professor Lieberthal, over here. Professor Lieberthal, I'm just wondering if I could follow up on something that you said. You've talked about these range of issues besides economic and trade, where there's this sort of anti-China sort of sentiment that's been suffused. And I'm wondering if you're really talking, are you talking, we know about presidential advisors like Navarro, Bannon, and then of course Lighthizer, and folks that have had a sort of pursuing less of an engagement strategy, a more confrontational strategy with China. But are you talking more now about the bureaucracy itself, that there's somehow over the years, predating Trump, that we've seen a suffusion of this anti-China or the more confrontational sentiment suffuse into the bureaucracy? How do you account for that? And then is this something that then we can expect to last for quite some time if it's a generation of bureaucrats that have sort of adopted this stance?
Very good question. Thank you for raising it. I think, first of all, the point I was trying to make was that this is occurring on both sides. And what's occurring in each country is encouraging pushback in the other. And so it's not simply a kind of anti-China mood that's taking over people who previously had a different view. I've seen it especially in our Defense Department and our intelligence agencies. And without getting into detail, let me just say for quite a while now, I've been startled when I talk to officials in the Defense Intelligence Agency, for example, or those kinds of folks. In other words, that are looking at what China is doing in detail that frankly is not public, but that like China, we have our folks that really work on the details of what the future holds and what you can tell by what you're observing now, right? And to use an American expression, they've had their hair on fire. They've said, if you saw what we saw, what these folks are now developing and how they're talking about it internally and what the exercises look like for, how these things will be put together and what gaps we have to fill and so forth, that's very different from what they're saying publicly, and they've been very frustrated that they can't get higher levels to understand that. And it's hard for any of us to know because we don't have access to that data. But I've heard it for long enough and across a sufficiently broad array of people that I know otherwise are not wacko people. They're specialists that I think it is sincere. Now, what to do about it? Some would say you've got to address it, but you do it in part through dialogues and cooperative agreements and various kinds of agreements on mutual restraint and confidence building measures and all that kind of thing. And others will say, we really have to use what we can to slow them down and disrupt them, and at the same time we have to advance our, speed up our own efforts. I'm sure on China's side they're saying the same thing. Right? So this is it's interactive and it's tough to break.
I agree with what Ken said. I mean, I don't think there's a anti-China sentiment in the bureaucracy in the United States, but there is a sense of increased focus on a tougher line with respect to China on particular issues. And cybersecurity is a key one where, and I think Ken is alluding in part to that, a key one where there's a growing sense of alarm on the U.S. side about Chinese activities. And I think the problem there is that this goes to Ken's fundamental point at the start, that there's not sufficiently developed systems and rules of communication about cybersecurity such that those problems won't spin out of control.
We have here. Okay.
I think in the general public, there are lots of the misunderstanding. For example, including myself, for this trade war, what Americans really want, what they really want the Chinese to do in order to satisfy what they think is unfair. I think the general public doesn't know this, only feel that American is trying to stop the Chinese advance in science and technology. And I think this is not true. So it's a lot of misunderstanding there.
Can I take a quick swat at that, because it's a very important point. President Trump, since the 1980s, has focused first on Japan and then on China, on the bilateral trade balance in goods. Okay, not in services, but in goods. Not in technology, not in all that. Bilateral trade balance in goods. And has firmly believed, unshakably believed, that if the U.S. runs a trade deficit in goods, then the other side is stealing from us, and we're suckers to let them get away with it. If you notice, as he talks about the trade war, it always comes back to the bilateral trade balance in goods. And by the way, that's growing, it's not shrinking. Mm-hmm. When he landed in Japan yesterday, it's not, he applies this criterion to everyone. When he landed in Japan, his first comment was, "It's a pleasure to be here, and I, have a very warm welcome from the Japanese." And of course, they like us because they haven't really played fair in this, and we're going to talk about that. And I'm sure they'll come around, and we'll have a very good relationship. Right? That's how he lands. I mean, it's amazing. A lot of what we're doing in our relationship with China that is seen from outside as being kind of a comprehensive, all-of-government approach to holding China back is largely irrelevant to President Trump's thinking, I believe. He is focused on the bilateral trade balance in goods. He really is. So Huawei, ZTE, North Korea, cross-strait, with every one of them, when asked, at a news conference, so he has to answer it, without a speech in front of him. He said, well, if we get the trade agreement, right, if they stop stealing from us in trade, then, this could go well, and he doesn't, from everything I've heard from people who have briefed him and who work in the government at a pretty high level, he frankly does not ask about other things. He's really not interested in it. It's a focus on this as a test of whether we're getting what we should get or not. And And it worries everyone else because, frankly, you know, it's, A, the economics of that are silly, and B, it means that you may put yourself out on a limb. On just a few days ago, I said, you know, Huawei, maybe we can take care of that in the trade agreement. Who knows? We'll see what happens. Literally said that 2 days ago. And that creates a problem because it's not surprising that the Chinese don't know exactly what he wants, because no one is really clear what combination of things will do the trick.
What time? What time?
Okay, well, yeah, I think demographics is really, really important. First time I went to China was 1982. Yeah,
Short
okay.
and sweet, not a lecture, please. We have to stop.
Okay, well, I think you need to take a better look because you guys really don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
You can address that demographic issue, but.
So let's have a hand for our panel.